Hey everybody, hope this finds you doing well. This is Danelle here at Networkchain. You can see that Bitcoin is currently trading at $84,431 at the time of this recording. Ethereum currently trading at $1,614. It's actually down almost 10% over the past week. We'll get into that in a moment. XRP is currently trading at $2.14. BNB 593. Solana, it's up 8%, currently trading at $128.78. Dogecoin, the biggest meme coin of them all, is basically flat over the past week, currently trading at 16 cents. We have Cardano rounding out the top 10, and it's up almost 1%, currently trading at around 64 cents. So there's been a lot of news lately regarding tariffs and the possibility of the United States levying tariffs on various countries around the world. And now there's been some backtracking, at least when it comes to which tariffs will become relevant with regards to different products and services. So really, I should say products. So news has come out recently over the last day that tariffs will not be applied to certain products like computers and chips. So companies like Apple and Nvidia and Broadcom, things of that nature, would be not as affected as initially thought, but it still remains to be seen what's actually going to happen. This is definitely a developing story when it comes to investing and investing in cryptocurrencies, particularly because it is a risk on asset. It still is very important to have a better idea of what's going on with the macroeconomic environment, because what's happened with the tariffs and the announcement of the tariffs caused the S&P 500 as well as equity markets to see a lot of volatility over the past week. There was some volatility with cryptocurrencies as well. Bitcoin has actually held up fairly well, but a lot of the other cryptocurrencies definitely saw a ton of downside over the past week. So if we look further at Bitcoin, we can see here, looking at the daily chart, that it definitely had some volatility as well in the earlier part of the past week. And you can see it actually dipped down to around $74,000 last week on last Monday, and it dipped back down to around $74,000 again on that Wednesday of April 9th. But then we saw a huge run up when we heard that there was going to be a pause on the tariffs, a 90-day pause that the U.S. was planning to levy on a lot of the other countries. One of the main trading partners is China, and so that is going to be a big deal to continue to watch out for, to find out what exactly happens with that. China, in turn, has also levied tariffs on the United States as well when it comes to their imports coming into China. So it's still a developing story, but it's something that you definitely want to keep an eye on, because we do see that the S&P and other equities definitely took a volatile turn because of the news with regards to tariffs, similar to having the same type of volatility that we had during the pandemic in 2020 and in some of the other major downturns. This particular downturn definitely is within the top 4 and top 5 downturns that we've ever had when it comes to a 3 to 5 day trading period. So you can see here that a few days ago, when it came to the S&P 500 and it being actually more volatile than Bitcoin, because the U.S. assets lost, I believe it was around $10 trillion over a 3 or 4 day trading session. So there was a lot of money that moved out of risky assets and just moved out of the stock market, period. And some went into bonds, some went into gold, and then some went into cash or CDs or money market accounts. So it's important to keep up with what's going on in the macro, because it can affect what's happening with Bitcoin. You can see here that Bitcoin's volatility has decreased compared to the S&P 500. So it's actually starting to show some different characteristics, because Bitcoin, generally speaking, at least in the past, when there was any type of major so-called like negative news that came out, Bitcoin would see violent downturns, and in turn also would have violent uptrends as well. But we're seeing that Bitcoin has basically stayed steady in that $70 to $80,000 range. You can see it actually hasn't even gone back down to 72 as of late. So we're still basically trading between that $74,000-$75,000 range and $84,000-$85,000 range. It's actually gotten up as high as around 88 or so over the past month. But we're looking to see if we're going to find resistance again in around this $88,000 range. And if we do, we could see ourselves potentially going back down to that $76,000 range. So we are kind of trading in this range right now, but it actually is a positive sign that is showing that Bitcoin is becoming more and more resilient when it comes to some other macroeconomic factors, unlike the S&P 500, which was very much affected. You can see here that the volatility was crazy. You see all these gaps in the trading of the S&P 500 over the last week or so. And you can see here when we zoom out, the volumes hasn't reached this level since the pandemic of 2020. Now, people are speculating there's a possibility we could have another V-shape recovery. As you can see here, it was a pretty quick return back to the highs in the S&P 500. It only took a few months for that to happen from the bottom in March of 2020. But we don't know what's going to happen when it comes to this tariff situation. It really depends on the day, sometimes the hour, what can happen to the market and the announcements that come out. So you definitely want to stay nimble, or at least have a worst case scenario in your mind, as opposed to not knowing what you were going to do, because these so-called black swan events can happen anytime, and we've definitely seen them more frequently over the past 20 years or so. So you always want to be prepared for potential downside, and the S&P 500 is definitely a way to kind of track to see what the overall sentiment is when it comes to investing in assets. We mentioned that we will discuss Ethereum. You can see here we're looking at the Ethereum over Bitcoin chart, and it has reached new lows that it hadn't seen since 2020. And you see that Bitcoin is outperforming Ethereum. So because this trend is continually going down, it's showing that the rate of return when it comes to Ethereum is continuing to lose against Bitcoin. So if you had your money in Bitcoin, you actually were doing a lot better when it comes to investing and how much of a return you would receive with Bitcoin as opposed to Ethereum. So it remains to be seen whether or not we'll get any type of bounce back. But if you look and zoom out a little bit and go back several years prior, you can see that it did bounce back once it hit that low in 2019 and 2020, and it did a huge move up in 2021 when we started on the last bull run, the last crypto bull run. But it remains to be seen whether or not this will happen again, obviously. But this chart does not look good at all. You can see the trend is absolutely going down, and that basically started since 2022. So it's been over 2 years that Ethereum has been underperforming against Bitcoin. So definitely something to continue to keep an eye on, because Ethereum is the largest asset behind Bitcoin as an altcoin. So if we take a look at Bitcoin compared to the S&P 500 and the QQQ, which is an index which tracks the top technology stocks, we can see that it's actually held up pretty well over the past several months. Over the last 4 months, we'll say year to date. You can see here that it actually is doing better than the QQQ index, and it's basically in that same range as the S&P 500. Now if we zoom out a little bit more, you can see that over time Bitcoin still has outperformed these indices. You can see that it's basically almost 6x more than the S&P 500 as well as the QQQ over the past year. And if we look over the past 5 years, Bitcoin has basically done a 10x, and the S&P 500 hadn't quite done a double in the past 5 years. And this is with regard to current prices. Now we know that the S&P 500 was much higher a few months ago, but given the volatility, it's gone down, and that goes for basically everything, as you can see over the past month or so. But even looking at the past month, Bitcoin is actually up 1% compared to the S&P 500 and QQQ being down approximately 3%. So another random news news story when it comes to NFTs. We haven't talked about that in a while. CryptoPunks, which is considered the Grail collection, the first 10,000 NFT collection on the Ethereum blockchain. They recently had a sale of one of the rarest CryptoPunks, which is an alien CryptoPunks, and it was sold for $6 million, which obviously is an incredible amount of money. So the person who sold the NFT has lost $10 million. Now, we don't really know for sure exactly when this person or entity actually got into Ethereum, because it definitely depends on what their cost basis of Ethereum was. But when we look at the actual sale, and one thing about the blockchain, as we've talked about before, is that it's transparent. So you're able to see exactly what's going on the blockchain, and you can see transactions transparently using something like Etherscan, for example, which is a tracker of the Ethereum, all the transactions on the Ethereum blockchain. So we can see here that CryptoPunks owner sold their NFT for $6 million worth of Ethereum this past week, and it netted a loss of 10 million. So at the time when they bought the piece, it was bought for 4,500 Ethereum, which was at the time 16 million. So we showed that chart how Ethereum has been losing against Bitcoin, not only losing against Bitcoin, but it's also been losing with regards to its USD value. So at its highs, it was around $4,000, and now it's trading, as we mentioned earlier in our video, at around $1,600. So it's definitely gone down tremendously when it comes to its all-time highs, more than 50%. And so since it was bought at $4,500 at the time, being 16 million, and now still around the same price, still, a little bit less, obviously, at 4,000 ETH, but now that 4,000 ETH is worth over $6 million. So that's an actual $10 million loss when you look at the US dollar value. So we definitely are seeing a continued bear market in NFTs. There are some that are still holding up fairly well, but for the most part, any of the Grail NFTs, when you look at Bored Ape Yacht Club, CryptoPunks, even Artifact, for example, these are some of the NFTs that had major run-ups in 2021 and 2022 particularly, and now we're seeing some of the lowest of lows over the past 4 to 5 years when it comes to NFTs. So definitely something to keep an eye out on. Hopefully people have learned a lot of lessons when it comes to NFTs, because it was definitely a very speculative market, still is, but we do believe that NFTs will continue to have more iterations, and it's not just going to be JPEGs, it's going to be way more than that when it comes to representation of digital and physical assets being, I should say, reflected as digital assets. So make sure to check us out here on X as well as IG. We continue to post there nearly every day. We thank you so much for watching us here on YouTube every week. We'll see you next week. In the meantime, take care. We look forward to linking up with you soon on the Network Chain. Bye-bye.